Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope everybody enjoyed that little intro. TJ here with Dead History, of course, and I am joined by a very special guest tonight. As you can see from that little intro video, myself and this gentleman have been to a lot of similar places and visited a lot of similar places. My very special guest is Dr. Joe Faykosh, who is a professor of history at Central Arizona College, and he is the founder, creator, podcaster for Visiting the Presidents, which is a wonderful, wonderful podcast that we're going to get into, and I highly, highly recommend that you guys go check that out because I love it. Me driving around, especially when I do all my bonus footage. Any of you familiar with my videos? I drive all over the place trying to find some unique things. And lots of times I'm listening to music and listening to Joe Faykosh with Visiting the Presidents as I drive around. So, Joe, welcome, and thank you for being here, sir.
Well, thank you. I appreciated the invite. I have been following the YouTube channel. It's always cool. I think when I started this out, not really knowing what I was doing, but to have people like yourself who kind of had it all together and know that you're not the only person out there that's interested in this odd little corner of the internet.
Yes, yes.
American history. I really, appreciate the invite. I appreciate getting the word out there about the podcast and about traveling and getting to experience the history for ourselves. So, yeah. I appreciate it.
Yo, absolutely. Well, thank you for being here, Joe. And yeah, it's funny, you say I have my stuff together. I really don't. I just wing this, and it actually turns out pretty well. But Joe, it's interesting because I obviously started following you on Instagram a while back now, and I've of course really enjoyed all of your posts and your Instagram posts. So finally, a few months back, I was like, I really got to check out this podcast. I'm not a huge podcaster. I've listened to podcasts in the past, but I really, really thoroughly enjoy yours. So like I said to everyone, now there is going to be links to all of Joe's information in the description of this video once it's posted on my YouTube channel. So go check out Visiting the Presidents anywhere that podcasts are available, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just type in Visiting the Presidents. You will see the podcast. Definitely check it out. You guys are going to love it. That's really what we're going to be talking about here for the next 45 minutes or so is all about that podcast and things that Joe has seen and places he's visited, as well as myself, as you saw, like I said, from that intro video. So now, Joe, to start off, I know you're a professor of history. Obviously, you have a love for history, but what and when, how did this whole love of the presidents and going to their locations and their birthplaces and, when did this fascination with the presidents really start for yourself? Why don't you tell us that?
It's harder to describe the origin story without, I've just never known a world where I didn't love the presidents. Some of my earliest memories are about the presidents. I had a neighbor who had a book with the presidents' portraits. Okay. And I remember my dad reading to me from it, and I've always had a ability to remember images and names. And so after a while, I started putting them in order and just wanting to read and hear more about them. Our first trip, my parents took me to, my mom was getting awarded. They both worked for Social Security, and they were in Washington, D.C. And so I remember my dad, we went to the White House, and he said, Ronald Reagan's in the White House and he's waving at you. And so I was excited to see Ronald Reagan. And then we had a trip that was planned when I was in kindergarten. My parents were so excited to take me to the Hall of Presidents. And famously, I sat there, and if you've ever seen the Hall of Presidents, the presidents are all introduced, and then Abraham Lincoln gives a speech, and that's kind of it. And little Joey just melted down. I thought they were all going to talk. I could have spent the whole vacation listening to my heroes. It would be like if you went to, the Harry Potter or Marvel, all of your favorite people are there. And so I think then my parents knew that there was something a little different about me. On that same trip back to Ohio, where I grew up, we stopped at the Abraham Lincoln gravesite. or sorry, his birthplace in Kentucky.
Kentucky, okay.
And that was my first, presidential site, and not the last, obviously, but I think it just really imprinted on me, like how important they were. Obviously, it's a beautiful temple like building, but then also, that they were human. He grew up in this log cabin and became president. Like it was a real kind of connection, I think, for me. And so I was just, ever since then, I was obsessed.
You've been hooked. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting because, when, again, for those of you that don't know, Joe's podcast, Visiting the Presidents, what he's doing, you just actually completed your first season, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And the way Joe is doing it, and correct me if I misspeak here, Joe, he's basically doing it in seasons. And the first season was all about the birth and the birthplace and the early life and childhood and kind of leading up to several years before their presidencies. And the very interesting thing, of course, the first season really, the big theme of it is the birthplace, because Joe has visited all of the birthplaces of all of our presidents. And I found it really interesting that you do say early on, I think it might even be your very first addition to your series, how they're human beings. And, we almost kind of look at presidents in this light of like, they're larger than life, of course, but they're people just like you and I. I know you even touched on in your podcast, like they needed to be changed at some point, and they cried for their mother and father. Like they were babies and they grew up and they went through the same types of things that we all do for the most part. So it is very interesting. And I know you also said that you get asked a lot about, like, who's your favorite president? And, you don't really have a favorite. You don't do it that way. However, I am at some point today going to put you on the spot about some of your favorite locations you've been to. So, but yes, that's very, very cool. It's interesting how you make that connection of the humanity behind it all. I love that. So Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky was one of your first big experiences. Now, I see you've gone all over the place. Now, over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, as soon as we have a new president that's voted into office, because, last 10 years or so, we've obviously seen from Obama to Trump to Joe Biden. Do you immediately, as soon as you see somebody new voted in, are you like, all right, where were they born? Where's this? Where's that? Do you start to research all these things and then start to plan out your journeys? Because I would assume, I know I just saw recently that you were in Hawaii and you saw a lot of Barack Obama's birthplace and childhood home and that sort of thing. And then I also saw that you were there in Scranton, Pennsylvania for Joe Biden's stuff. So is it something is that what you do? You learn about these people that are going to be newly elected into office and sworn in January, and then you start mapping it out in your head? Or how does that process work for you?
I think so. I mean, it really started very organically, this whole I'm going to go to every one. I do remember reading an article, and I should have looked up his name. I'll look it up. But he had gone to some of the birthplaces. He didn't get a chance to go to all of them, and he had a research grant. And this was when I was finishing my dissertation and not yet hired to do this. And I was bored at work one day, I'll be honest. And I wanted a Google map, and I was just going to find where each place was and start to make, okay, this is the birthplace, this is the gravesite. And then from there, I just started feeling out like, okay, well, I could probably do, those 4 in the same day, or that's right next to each other. And if I just went to Virginia, I could knock out a bunch. And
of course,
if I was, focused on doing this. With the question about more recent presidents, it's been a lot easier. There's so many people that'll do it for you. I know you follow Louis Picone, and he with him, he already had it like ready to go when Joe Biden took the oath of office. So I was able to see like, okay, that's what the building's going to look like. He went to the childhood home. He went to the Hank's Hoagies and some of these other sites. So that made it a lot easier for me. The thing I've learned is that there's always people who are doing one or the other. Like people know where. And the internet is very helpful in that way. And so
Yeah.
I think that was one of the main goals of the podcast, is showing people like this is doable if you're interested in doing it. And if you're not interested in checking all of the names off the box, you can at least, if you're living like you in New Jersey, you can find like, here's a few that are there, and which ones can I go to within a day's journey, that kind of thing. So,
of course. Yeah.
But yeah, Joe Biden's was the priority for this year. I wanted to knock Scranton off the list. So.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Yeah, no, it's interesting. And you're right. Because when I first started the whole gravesite hunting, it's not something I ever thought about in my life, to be completely honest with you. I got this idea in my head, and then it became like this mission, I gotta go see all these, of course. And you get that itch. And it is interesting. The more I researched it, and of course, I ended up connecting and meeting people like Kurt Dion, who is a wonderful gravesite hunter who's
shout out Kurt.
Kurt, of course. Kurt's Historic Sites. Go check out his website, which is awesome. He's been doing it since he was a young kid, and then I started talking to people like that. But when I started looking into it even more, I found articles online of people who did this kind of thing with grave sites and such, back 25, 30, 40 years ago. And even stories of them, there was no GPS. There was no you had to. I remember one guy's telling a story of he searched in the pouring rain for Martin Van Buren's gravesite in Kinderhook for 40 minutes because he had no idea where it was in the cemetery. And anybody who's ever seen Martin Van Buren's gravesite, there's a cemetery on both sides of the road. So it's very, if you don't know, you don't know. So
and I've had a few times like that where I've gone to the site, but my internet will cut out, and I'm like,
yeah.
I mean, it was like that. The one that sticks out to me is Chester Arthur's gravesite.
Oh, yeah.
Albany Rural Cemetery, I think it's called.
Albany Rural.
Okay, I could be here for the rest of the day if I don't find it.
yeah, because that's not a small cemetery. It's a pretty large cemetery. Yeah. No, it's interesting because we've become so reliant on the internet and these devices in our hands, of course, that we don't realize that even in things that we're doing that are not really super important, they're more for pleasure and enjoyment and hobby, we rely on it so much. And it happened to me traveling around all over the country last year in rental cars. There was times I remember in South Texas, I was driving, I believe it was to get John Nance Garner, I believe, is buried all the way in South, literally where there was a sign that said 10 miles to the Mexican border. We're talking South Texas. And I remember I lost cell phone service for 2 hours, in South Texas. Because and you're thinking to yourself, what happens if I get stuck out here? What do I do? So it is interesting. So
one thing when I first started, I would map it out, right? And I would have it down to the side of the house that the bedroom, I found was on. But then there was a part of me when I first started actually going to these sites that was I do kind of like the hunting aspect of it, where I can go to this town and see if I can find it. And then in the back pocket, okay, when I get desperate, where is it? If I'm going to Princeton Cemetery to look for Grover Cleveland, it's nice to take in the entire cemetery. Do I have a feel for where it is? But then if it's an hour in, I need to find Grover. And, so I do try to make sure that there is still that fun aspect to it, but as well, I want to safeguard.
Of course. No, absolutely. So now, out of all of your travels, now correct me if I'm wrong, so you've seen every birthplace, you've been to every gravesite, correct?
Right.
And now what about death sites where the president died? Have you seen all of those or most of those? Or I know some are not accessible. I understand that, but the ones that are accessible, have you seen all of those?
It's I think Kurt actually asked me that question over the summer, and I hadn't ever been to James Garfield's Wayside there in front of the Art Museum in Washington. And so I think when I counted for him, it was 25. And I count being in the White House, that's where William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, I would count that as opposed to I don't have to be in the side of the second floor.
Of course.
Yeah, I think it's 25. The more recent ones are just going to be harder in terms of locating their homes, and then certainly the death sites. When they're still functioning hospitals, I still have a hard time with that. But
Yeah,
yeah, all the grave sites. With birth sites, I didn't take a photo in front of Obama's. Like, it wasn't a concerted effort, but I know exactly where it is. I've seen it from the car, but I need to like get down and take that. That one's my kind of white whale at this moment. Like, I'm killing myself because I didn't take a photo in front of it, but all of the grave sites, all of the museums, and then trying to knock out as many of the accessible homes as possible. But with some of them, they had multiple they're moving all over, and
of course, yeah.
trying to get to that is going to be kind of tricky.
No, it is, and it's interesting because when I was doing my presidential series on YouTube, I'm on to my vice presidential series, but toward the end of my presidential series, when I was doing my Richard Nixon video, I went up to the Bear's Nest in New Jersey, which is the townhouse complex that Nixon actually, that's where he fell ill and was transported from there to the hospital where he later died, of course. But it's a private community. It's gated. You can't get in. And when I was just taking some photos on actually public road, the roadway outside, just taking some photos of the signs and stuff, the security guard of the townhouse complex was like, "You got to go." And it was like, so yeah, it was pretty interesting. You just never know. Like you said, some of these places you just can't access. Now, you said something very interesting to me just the other day, Joe, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here. So you said you have just a funny inkling that you think when the time comes, hopefully it's not for another like 50 years, hopefully, that you feel that Barack Obama may be cremated when he passes away. Is that just...
I just have a weird feeling that it's going to happen at some point, and I just feel like it's going to be him. I think
he's going to be the first.
Yeah, I think he's unorthodox enough that I think it might be one of those choices. The more eco-friendly that I read some of the discussions about the library and museum that they're building, and I could just see him wanting to continue thinking outside the box. And then I think about Donald Trump. I've read where there's the possibility that he might be buried on one of his private properties in a place that wouldn't be accessible to the public. So something like that would be really challenging to our community to be able to access. And I just feel like that's probably going to happen at some point. I don't know if it's those two presidents necessarily, but we've just been lucky to this point that they've been really accessible.
You're right, because there now is, of course, two vice presidents that have been cremated. Nelson Rockefeller, but his ashes actually are interred on the Rockefeller estate property, which is private. It's not accessible to the public. I know at least one person who has seen it, but most people have not. And then, of course, Walter Mondale was just recently cremated, and we don't even know, us in this kind of like grave hunting type, community, we don't even know where his ashes are. I mean, obviously, I'm sure they're in family's hands, but are they going to be interred somewhere? Who knows? So it is interesting to see what's going to happen down the road with a president. I can see what you're saying about Barack Obama possibility. I don't think there's something that tells me that Donald Trump will not be buried on private property, because I feel like Donald Trump will probably want the biggest memorial ever erected so everyone and their brother could come see it. So
I think like with that, maybe in the back of his mind, it would be what happened to his star in Hollywood, the Walk of Fame. He's the one the vandalism or damage to it, and definitely, like, if he's going to be buried in New York or New Jersey, that would be a real concern.
Sure. I think if anything, he may be the first to go down to Florida. That's kind of just my thinking, but who knows? We already actually have a couple questions. One is actually from Kurt. He has two questions for you. I'll get right into that. So Kurt asked, which season 1 episode was the most difficult for Joe to create and why? So let's start with that first question from Kurt.
I mean, I would think the first one, just in terms of the technical aspects, I know what I like in podcasts, and I also know a lot of what I don't like. And so wanting to put out a polished product, but one that was accessible and had the kind of information, I kept thinking, like, what would I want out of a podcast on this topic? If I lost all my memory and found this podcast. Like, would it resonate with me? And so making sure that it had the content that I was looking for, but at the same time that it would be something that other people would get something out of.
Yeah.
In terms of like the content, I think it's always a little tricky to me as we got more recent, where these are men that many of us have grown up having some kind of position on, and wanting to be clear, like, I'm not trying to wade into political waters. I'm just giving you the information and trying to be balanced about it. And so I just was very nervous about the last three in particular, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. It's just, I know there's a lot of baggage emotionally for a lot of people, and I didn't want to kind of have to incorporate that. And so I took my time with those, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it's a good point. Now, Kurt's question second question is, in Joe's opinion, who gave the best presidential site tour? And then, of course, he says no pressure, of course, with a little wink, because Kurt used to give a presidential site tour. He worked at the Adams facility there in Quincy, Massachusetts. So he has he's a little biased towards there, I'm sure. But what would you say, in your opinion, for all these places? See, now before you answer that, to preface this, when I did all my travels, I had very unique experiences with grave sites, because I saw grave sites that are generally very crowded with tourists, such as Mount Vernon, or even in Springfield with Lincoln. I had them all to myself because I went during a pandemic, so it was very unique. However, the downside of that is all of these presidential libraries and museums and such, they were closed. So I got to see them and take pictures on the outside, like, hey, but I never got to take the tours and such that you've been afforded to. So in that regard, I'm going to really lean on you, because I'm going to take your opinion to heart when I get to finally go back to some of these places. So best presidential site tour, what's your opinion?
It's tricky. So Kurt, just as a little background, Kurt, when he first contacted me, we were talking about the Adams sites in Quincy, and he asked when I had gone to visit, and I told him it was the summer of 2019, and I believed that it was June. And he said, I probably was the one who gave you the tour. And so I went back to my photos, and you can see his shirt in one, and you can see his hand. And so we're like, oh my gosh, like we met, we didn't know it, but
look at that.
Certainly down the road. I remember him giving a very detailed and good tour. The others that stand out to me, I had really great experience this last year going to the James Garfield birthplace. I wanted to revisit it, and so I had a great tour guide, Debbie Weinkammer. She's fabulous. And then I made a friend with Sean Sandrock, who runs the Ronald Reagan birthplace in Tampico or Tampico.
Yeah, Tampico. Yep.
In terms of the homes, I think Monticello and Mount Vernon are kind of second to none in terms of the breadth of what they offer. That isn't just about the president, it's also what the place means, and they're just always kind of going back and doing a better job of contextualizing. Just from the time when I went when I was a child to now, it's just a completely different tour, and that takes a lot of courage to re-examine and want to open it up a little bit more and take a mirror to your face and say, like, okay, what are we not saying? What are we not doing? In the same way, I love the Berkeley Plantation, where William Henry Harrison was born. That one's probably my favorite of the birthplaces that I got to visit, just because there's so much history at that site.
Oh, yes, there is.
And then the museums, I'd probably want to say the George H.W. Bush. I had a good tour guide at that one.
Excellent.
College Station.
So, yeah, College Station. So, of course, it was closed when I went last year. Of course, I got to see, his gravesite, which I thought was beautiful. The path back there, very beautiful area. But that building, the statue of him, the piece of the Berlin Wall outside, I was so disappointed that it wasn't open, because I really think I would have enjoyed that. So that's interesting you say that. Just the place itself and how beautifully kept and magnificently well landscaped and groomed it is. It just looked like it would have been a wonderful experience. So.
Yeah, I think with the museums, and I'll get to this down the road in season 4, but it's tricky where you can see that some of them want to give as much background on the president, and others want to make it experiential and reach different generations. So people that don't remember that presidency, how do they access it? And so I think in that way, the older presidential museums do a somewhat better job of that. And I'm just going to be honest, I'm kind of disappointed when I visited the George W. Bush and the Bill Clinton museums, because they are so much more about the time period rather than the individual. And I think that will change over time, but
Yeah.
it's definitely like a trap that I can see being really tempting when you're first presenting a president and opening it right away. You want to make it, an experience for, everybody to come to. But then when it comes to presenting the individual, some of the less visited ones are really great. If you ever get the chance to go to Harry Truman's in Independence, or Dwight Eisenhower's in Abilene, Kansas, is always up. Like every time I visited, they're redoing a different part. And I just went to the Richard Nixon 2 weeks ago, and they're the same way, where it's just been a different experience each time, and adding new wrinkles here and there. That it does take a lot to kind of add in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. So it's very interesting that you just touched on the Berkeley plantation. And the reason that it's interesting is because I visited there last year, of course. Now, I not only was looking, for birthplaces and such, I was also not only on a mission for presidential and vice presidential grave sites, I was on a mission for Declaration and Constitution signers' grave sites. And of course, William Henry Harrison's, is it great-grandfather or grandfather?
His father, Benjamin.
Oh, it's his father. It's his father? Okay.
Yeah.
So he was obviously Declaration signer. His grave site's there at, on the grounds of the Berkeley plantation. So I have to show this real quick because it's actually a funny story, and I have to share it because it is pretty funny. What happened to me at the Berkeley plantation was I pulled up. Now, keep in mind, everyone, this is like June or so, probably June, July of last year, height of the pandemic, everything's closed. And I see this when I pull up, and this giant tree across the roadway, and this cone and everything saying that it was closed, as you can see. And if Joe remembers from his memory, that dirt road that you saw where that tree was, that was literally, it's a solid mile to mile and a half to the actual plantation home, okay, down a dirt road. So, sometimes when you're doing this, you have this mentality of I got to get it. I parked my rental car there, and I decided to hoof it and walk that dirt road. Well, here was the interesting thing. So I go down, I see the Berkeley plantation home, take a couple photos of that, and I have GPS aware that the gravesite is, so I go past the home. Now, there's other private homes back there that are actually still occupied. And I saw a couple of people sitting on their porch. They probably looked at me and were like, who the hell is this guy? But this is where it gets kind of funny. So I go see the gravesite of Harrison's father, the Declaration signer, right on the river there. It's beautiful. It was wonderful. As I'm walking back up, I'm kind of right next to the plantation home on this dirt road to head, a mile or so back to the car. And I hear loud barking and running toward me.
Oh, no.
So I'm a dog lover. I've lived with dogs my whole life, but I have to admit that I pretty much pooped my pants at that point because I didn't know. And I see these two large dogs running at me. Luckily, they were friendly dogs. But needless to say, my heart was in my throat because I really wasn't supposed to be down there. It was closed and the road was closed. And these dogs don't know me from Adam. So, but the funny story is I almost got attacked or thought I was getting attacked at the Berkeley plantation by dogs, which I didn't. And then the one was a yellow lab. He literally had a stick in his mouth and followed me the entire mile down the dirt road to my car. And I kept periodically throwing the stick for him. So I made a friend at the Berkeley plantation.
Which is about the best you could have ended up.
Yeah. Pretty funny story. So I had to bring that up. But so a couple other questions that I see that I don't want to miss these questions. So Les, one of my good subscribers, he's actually over in the UK. Shout out to Les. He said, if Nixon is buried closest to his birthplace, who's the president buried furthest away from their birthplace. Kurt chimed in, and I agree. It's got to be Reagan from Illinois to California. I would imagine that's the furthest. Now, it will be interesting to see if Barack Obama does get buried one day and he gets buried at his library in Chicago. He will definitely be the furthest, at least, to that time. Then he also asked Les, which two presidents' birthplaces are closest together? And I'm almost positive I know the answer is John and John Quincy. Yeah. I mean, they're literally right next door. I mean, would you say, what are they, 100 feet away from one another?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. It's not far
I mean,
at all.
It's literally two buildings right next door to one another, the Adams, John and John Quincy. So that's definitely the two that are, birthplaces that are closest together. So something else I wanted to ask you, put you on the spot a little bit. Let's stick with birthplaces because that was your first season that you just did on your podcast. I want you to tell me what was your favorite presidential birthplace you visited and what was your least favorite and why? There has to be a reason. Sometimes I'll be perfectly honest with you. I've visited even some grave sites, and some of them one of them that sticks out in my head that I was overwhelmingly surprised that I loved was Herbert Hoover. I love his gravesite. I think it's beautiful and magnificent. And then I've gone to others. Thomas Jefferson's my favorite president, not my favorite person, favorite president, same birthday, same initials. So, it's kind of one of those things. And Monticello is one of my favorite places, but his gravesite itself, it's kind of underwhelming to me. It definitely sticks with the theme of those early presidents being buried on their plantation sites and that sort of thing, but just underwhelming. So why don't you touch on that? Favorite birthplace, least favorite, and tell us why.
Okay. Before I do, Kurt, maybe you can do the math on. I was just thinking of HW going from Milton to
Milton, Massachusetts, and then
just do the math. And if W is buried in, I think he wants to be buried at he's changed his mind and rather than being buried in Austin, he wants to be buried in Dallas.
Correct.
So if you can look up New Haven to Dallas. I think it would still be Reagan, but I think they wouldn't be. The Bushes wouldn't be.
That's close.
Behind.
That's real close. Yeah, because you got to remember, Illinois is middle of the country, so I bet you it's close. That's
as
a good
the crow
call.
Flies. I'm thinking it might be a little bit closer.
That's a good call. Kurt, do the math. Yeah, you got to. I'm sure you're watching. You have a challenge now.
So in terms of my favorite and least favorite, I am doing an episode where I'm going to kind of rank I'm doing a top 10 of my birthplaces.
So not giving too much away. Just give us a little hint here.
Okay. So for favorites, I definitely separate it in terms of I don't think you can top being able to go inside the Berkeley Plantation and all of the history. Just for those of you who aren't too familiar with William Henry Harrison's birthplace, on that site is, as TJ pointed out, where his father, who signed the Declaration, Benedict Arnold, comes through and torches as much as he can get his hands on. William Henry Harrison's born there. It's where they had the first Thanksgiving in America.
Yep.
A year before what will take place at Plymouth. It's where they first make bourbon in America. And it's where they first played Taps, the song that you're familiar with, when it was a Civil War camp. So there's just so much going on. And unfortunately, we have so many birthplaces that were destroyed, by neglect, like James Madison's falls into the river and Thomas Jefferson's burns down. A lot of them burn down. And then there's others where they get moved around a lot. And so I would put Berkeley at the top or near the top. And I always think for the same reason, Franklin Roosevelt's getting to go inside his home, Springwood and Hyde Park. There's just so much history. And he stands out because he lived in his home as an adult. Everybody else moves away. Franklin will keep going back to that's his home as he gets older.
Spent a lot of his presidency there, a lot.
And he's buried there, his museum's there, so it's all of that tied in together. So those are the two kind of at the top. I also had this great experience, TJ, with your hero. It happens to be my dad's favorite president, Thomas Jefferson, as well. And when I visited the 2 times now to the birthplace, I went in the first time and I had read about it online, and obviously there's a sign on the side of the road, but then I would read about this marker and this stone that was placed on the actual site. And when I went this afternoon, then there was a gate up, and disappointed for sure.
Yeah.
But the next day I had this like compulsion. I can't explain it. That was like, you need to go back by the site. And when I went back, the gate was open.
I
And so
love it.
like your
I love it.
Berkeley experience, I was like, well, I have to go.
You
Like,
have to do
I'm
it.
gonna kick myself if I don't
Of
at least
course.
see it. Thankfully, there was a worker. He was kind of plowing the fields or planting maybe. And so I just said, like, I know where this marker is. I can probably know it from my head without seeing it. And so he's like, just go. He didn't care too much, and I was able to get to experience that. And the exact same thing happened this last year when I went back. I went the first day and it was gated, and the next day I was like, let's just go back, let's see what happens, and it was open again. And so
next time you're in Charlottesville, Joe, you gotta let me know, because you apparently have the
touch. I don't know.
Touch, yeah. And I have to see this. So now, from where that gate is, I know exactly what you're talking about. How far back roughly is the marker? Is it like
it's probably like a quarter mile? It's not much more than that.
Yeah.
And just a dirt path. And this last time there were so many weeds in the path. Like I was like, am I gonna get stuck going back here for this? But
yeah.
At the same time, like I just knew if you don't go, you're gonna be so disappointed.
Of course.
On the negative, on the least one, I mean, I have to kind of again separate them in that there's some that aren't marked, with the more recent presidents like George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But then Franklin Pierce, his home is in the bottom of a lake, and they have his homestead where he grew up, and his father, who was governor of New Hampshire, lived, but not a birth marker. And then in that other category, there's just like weird, the one that stands out to me, I kind of have a soft spot for it, though, is James Buchanan's, where he was born in Cove Gap.
Yep.
This tiny town outside of Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. And they have this pyramid that
it looks like a pyramid.
Yeah. And when I went, it was the experience you had where I was just completely by myself, and you could hear, a stone drop like 3 miles away. It was so desolate, but it was just kind of cool in that way. I can't think of too many like really negative ones. The one that always makes me sad is Benjamin Harrison in North Bend, Ohio. Most of the people who go to North Bend are going to see William Henry Harrison's home, or his gravesite, sorry. And he had this kind of nice house there, and then it burned down, and they just give him one side of one street marker. The other side is about his grandfather. And I thought, if you're the president, you should have like more than one half of one sign. So
exactly. Yeah. So what about the gas station? What about Hayes?
I do give that one a most improved, where when I went the first time, it was just a marker by the BP station. And it was a gray day. It was awful looking in Delaware, Ohio. But then when I went back through this last year, they had put up a statue on the street corner kind of adjacent to it. They had a new marker. It's definitely different. It's much better looking. So yeah, I definitely appreciated it a lot more. They've at least worked at making it a better site. So
wow, that's awesome. Good stuff. So Kurt actually wrote that he wasn't able to look it up right now because he's busy, but I just looked it up. So here we go. Here's the results from Tampico, Illinois, where Reagan was born, to the Ronald Reagan Library there in Simi Valley, California. It's actually 1,933 miles. And then if you do Milton, Massachusetts, down to College Station, where George H.W. Bush was born and then is buried, it's 1,871. So it's literally about 65 miles of a difference. That's it.
Wow.
So literally, Reagan wins by about 65 miles. So great call on that, Joe, and wonderful that we were able to look that up. So so here we go. Now, there's another question here. By the way, this is from Political Facts and Feats, which is a channel on YouTube. Really cool channel. All they do is these like 10-minute videos of like facts and feats and, president's favorite foods and all that kind of stuff. If you haven't already, guys, everybody go subscribe. Political Facts and Feats, really awesome YouTube channel. But they ask, who was the president born the most north, most west, most south, and most east? Most north, I would assume, has to be Chester Arthur.
Arthur.
Yeah, because there's even talk that it was possibly Canada. So
right. And most west is definitely Nixon.
It's definitely Nixon. Yeah, it's got to be in Yorba Linda.
Most East, I believe it's technically John Quincy Adams. It's between the Adamses, and it's the location of the building. And I think it's such that I did this. John Quincy is, I think, the more Eastern one, but if he isn't, it's his dad. And then the most Southern, I believe, is Lyndon Johnson.
It's got to be. It's got to be Johnson. It's got to be.
Where Jimmy Carter was in place.
I think it's got to be Lyndon Johnson. Yeah. So interesting. Very cool. So let's see here. What else? What about presidents' birthplaces that are disputed, like Arthur and Jackson? Joe, go to both. So just so I'm going to let Joe, of course, answer this. Just so everybody knows, the Andrew Jackson controversy, it looks like over the last, I think it was fairly recently, it looks like that's been kind of put to rest, and it looks like it's overwhelmingly probably South Carolina wins that debate. However, there's markers in both North and South Carolina due to the area, the Waxhaws. And Joe, you can touch on that in a second. Now, the Arthur debate, really, for lack of a better term, the Canadian debate that he was born in Canada, it really doesn't hold much water. It was more, from everything I've researched, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, it was more of a political type, ploy back then. The other side kind of used that to try to dissuade people from voting for Arthur or, favoring Arthur. The other side, the other political party was trying to, kind of get a little knock to Arthur and saying he was born in Canada. And I think historians over the years have pretty much proven that there's really not, it doesn't hold much water, the whole Canadian debate. But Joe, have you been to these sites, both Jackson, and if you can touch on the whole Arthur debate real quick?
Yeah, with Andrew Jackson's, I did go to both sites. There is a Museum of the Waxhaws on the North Carolina side. There's a marker maybe 2 miles away, 3 miles away that says it's 2 miles in this direction. And then there's an actual marker on the site that they believe it happened. Now, the dispute is for a few reasons. The border of North and South Carolina changed over the years as well. And then there's this dispute about whether or not Andrew's mother delivered at one sister-in-law's house or the other. Mm-hmm. And if she had delivered at the one, it would be in the North Carolina side. At the other, it would be in the South Carolina side. But either way, very close to the border. And one thing that's clear between Jackson and Garfield and many of the other presidents is they really didn't care too much about their birthplaces. Like Andrew Jackson was a little ambivalent about it for the longest time. Chester Arthur thinks it's just a kind of complete non-factor.
Yeah.
With Jackson on the South Carolina side, they have the Andrew Jackson State Park, and they have a statue of him as a little boy, a statue of him on horseback, a giant marker. And so they've gone to great lengths to say, no, it's really, he's one of ours. And then Andrew Jackson himself did say that he believed he was a South Carolinian.
Yeah, he said that in a speech, right? Like my fellow South Carolinians. Yeah.
Right. And so with Chester Arthur, the thing that is tricky is that his mother was American, his father was Canadian. And if I have that backwards, forgive me, but I believe that's the order it went. And they did deliver children in the Canadian side. So there was reason for questioning. His father was a minister and was always getting fired, frankly, from one parish to the other. And he believed he was born there. But the accusations against him were such that they were saying that Chester assumed the identity of his dead brother. His brother was born in America, but he was born in Canada. And so the family conspired to say he was actually born in the American side. And so he took the identity of his brother. And Arthur doesn't help things. He lies about the year he was born. He's a little vain. Says he's born in 1830, but was born in 1829. So him stretching the truth in one thing, I think, aroused suspicion that like he might be lying about another thing.
Well, wasn't it on his gravesite? Wasn't the year wrong too, or something to that effect?
I think so. I think that's the case as well.
Yeah.
And again, he was just like, who cares? Like, why do you guys care so much? And in the same way, when we think about the Barack Obama,
controversy,
conspiracy theories, that go into it. There's all of these questions about like how. My thing is always like, how crazy would you have been to be a parent to doctor the newspaper back then? Like, who is the thing that I have found from researching their rise to power is there is none of those men who could have thought that they were going to end up in the White House. Maybe, like a Franklin Roosevelt, maybe,
of course. Yeah.
there's a couple, but anybody else, you would be insane to be like, well, this kid is going to be the one we should be doctoring, the newspaper accounts of his birth.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting you say that because, to kind of briefly touch on that, not only like doctoring newspapers and documents, Louis Bacone actually always points out, when it comes to like the birthplaces, even just the buildings and structures themselves, no one had the foresight to know that that person was going to end up, in the White House, like you said. So really, their birthplaces don't become significant until they're elected president. So, it's really kind of one of these things, especially the early, era presidents. We're fortunate enough to even have the locations, and in some instances, like the Adams, the pretty much the exact location and structures, still around today. Where, somebody like Jackson, it was just like, or Arthur, it just didn't seem like a big deal to those people. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The one thing that I've really been interested in too is how the commemoration starts to take place. In some cases, as soon as they become governor or some other elected office, people say like, well, let's put up a marker or something like that. And then there's some where they get through office and finally people are like, well, we should probably do something about this guy.
Yeah.
And I think a lot has to do with, your family wanting to, commemorate you. Certainly the case with like a James Monroe, where it was his family for the longest time that was keeping up these markers at his birthplace. And then there's others where, Harrison moves away from Indianapolis. I'm talking about Benjamin the grandson.
Yeah.
And there wasn't that North Bend connection for the rest of his life. He never goes back. He never revisits the site that we can find. And so I think probably to a lot of people, it's like, well, he isn't any of us anymore either. There's a disconnect that can happen when somebody moves away. And so that part can be tricky too. Dwight Eisenhower is a great example of somebody who, when he becomes a World War II hero, they're like, let's find the exact spot where he died or where he was born. But, not everybody's Dwight Eisenhower. Not everybody's the hero of the Second World War.
And it's interesting, somebody like Eisenhower, very small town, Abilene, Kansas, where everything, even to this day, everything is the Ike garage, the Ike deli, everything. It's very tourist related, and of course, they're very proud of Dwight Eisenhower. So,
and that's the stuff I love. It really pains me to go to some of these towns where they don't mention the president at all. And I think, like, Eisenhower's one, but also if you ever go to Marion, Ohio, where Warren Harding lived, they have Harding buildings and Harding High School and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
So it pains me when I go to a place and they're like, they can't even bother to mention the guy. Like, I think I would go hog wild if I knew I was from a town that had a president.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's interesting. I know I'm sure you've probably seen some, of course, but right now, me researching and doing a lot of things on the vice presidents currently on my YouTube channel. It's, I've seen all the vice presidential grave sites with the exception of Rockefeller, of course. And it's so interesting, even just to see some of like their birthplaces or even just homes they actually lived in almost pretty much up to their death. Some of them are like not around anymore. There's no marker for them. There's several that there are, but it's interesting how this person was literally one heartbeat away from becoming president of the United States. And, there's nothing really significant around for them. So it's interesting. Before we wrap up here, a couple things I want to ask you now. Me being a huge gravesite person, as far as the presidential gravesites are concerned, I want you to give me a favorite of yours that you've visited and a least favorite, and again, why. I have mine, me personally, just so people that aren't aware, and so you're aware, Joe, my favorite presidential gravesite is Lincoln's tomb, and it's only because I had a very unique experience there. Like I said, they were only letting a very small amount of people go into the tomb at a time for COVID reasons. And I was the only solo person there. And I went when it was literally closing at the end of the day. I didn't know that. I just got lucky. There was about maybe 9 people there beside me, but they were all families in small groups. So I let them do their thing. I was looking at like the original holding tomb at the bottom of the hill, all this stuff while they were inside. finally the the tour guide, who was just standing outside the tomb letting people in, he finally says to me, "Okay, it's all yours." And I literally walked in and had the entire Lincoln tomb to myself. And I remember, like, anyone who's ever been there, it's this beautiful tomb inside. And when you first walk in, there's a small replica statue of Lincoln. And then you turn to your right, and there's more statues representing different periods of his life. And then you walk down this, fairly long, like, marble corridor. And I remember, like, I could literally hear my shoes, like, clanking against the floor. And the closer you get toward where the sarcophagus is and Lincoln's tomb is, I could, like, feel like the hair on my arms standing up. It was so incredible, such a cool experience. So, but then I go to somebody like my own native New Jerseyan, Grover Cleveland. I go to his gravesite, and I'm like, that's it, Grover? I mean, come on. Like, you wouldn't even know. I know Dr. Thomas Balcerski chimed in earlier because he just went there with me a few weeks ago to the Princeton Cemetery. And, like he said, you could walk right past Grover Cleveland's gravesite and never know it's a president sitting there because there's nothing on his grave that signifies president. There's no sign, pointing toward it. So, that's underwhelming, especially being from New Jersey. It fits the man. It fits Grover Cleveland, his personality. But so, you go from those highs to lows. So in your opinion, favorite, least favorite gravesite?
I'll give you a few of each. For whatever reason, the one that first came to mind, I love Chester Arthur's for just how over the top.
Very cool.
The weeping angel. It's pretty incredible. Whenever I've taken a photo of it, people are always like, "Whoa!"
It's cool. Yep.
That one's pretty cool. But in terms of like what you're saying, the over the top ones are, you can't not appreciate James Garfield's in Cleveland. It is gorgeous, and I've gone different times, and one time was able to go up into the dome and look down. And in the same way, I would shout out the Grant Tomb for that same purpose. It's just overwhelming, very, very European when you think of like the tombs for Napoleon in Les Invalides in Paris. I would also say there's something about both Dwight Eisenhower's and John F. Kennedy's. Kennedy's, I think, is just iconic. The setting, the eternal flame, the view of Washington. And then with Dwight Eisenhower's, kind of understated chapel, I think. It maybe doesn't come across as understated to other people, but it's a very quiet, reflective area.
Sure.
And I like that. And when you shouted out Herbert Hoover's earlier, I just love that it's within sightline of his birthplace. That's pretty cool. And I do like some of the presidents where they're just in a summit. Like I think of Calvin Coolidge just being on the hill and just being one of several generations of Coolidges. And
it's one of my favorite places. Truly is. Yeah.
It's like going into the play Our Town.
Yeah.
And my least favorite, I would have to say for sure, the one that first comes to mind is Gerald Ford's.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to disparage him at all, but his and Reagan's both where they're like in the wall. I don't know. It doesn't do anything for me, especially not when you see like the different plots for others. I think the other one that comes to mind is Franklin Pierce's. It just felt very like shabby the time that I went, and maybe deserving of a nice renovation. And poor James Polk, that he's just kind of like in the forgotten corner of the Tennessee State Capitol State Capitol grounds. And the structure looks like it's chipping in its paint, and I really hope he gets moved.
Well, I was just going to say, there's talk about him being moved again. So this would be the third time for Polk being moved. So interestingly enough, and it's interesting that you say about Franklin Pierce. Pretty sure, I could be wrong, and somebody, if Kurt's still on, maybe he could correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure the state of New Hampshire didn't even recognize him really as like president for the longest time, and it didn't even say president on his grave for the longest period of time. And now it actually does say 14th president. But it's interesting when you see things like that, like Pierce. It's very underwhelming. In my opinion, Cleveland, very underwhelming. And Polk, like you said, poor Polk. And the thing about Ford I will touch on is not only is it just kind of there with the wall, like you said, but I mean, you literally can hear like the interstate right when you're standing at his gravesite. There's nothing like quiet and somber about it. It's very and yes, I agree with you on Reagan's being very similar in the aesthetics, but I don't know if you can beat the viewpoint. The view from Ronald Reagan's grave of Simi Valley may be the nicest view that any presidential gravesite has, maybe outside of Kennedy's. So
yeah, I would put Kennedy just slightly higher, but yeah, it's a very nice setting.
Yeah,
I did also want to say the James Monroe grave, they've repainted it, and
the birdcage,
very particular. Like, it's a very interesting structure.
It's unique. It's very unique. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about Monroe, obviously, about 50 feet in front of him, of course, Mr. John Tyler. Tyler, there was nothing. There wasn't even a marker there for many years. It was literally like a little hill of dirt.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. I always found it fascinating. I always say this on a lot of my different live streams, that Tyler's the only U.S. president to have a flag that was not the United States flag draped over his casket. He had the Confederate flag. So it's a very interesting thing. So before we wrap up here, one more thing. If you couldn't, here we go. If you couldn't be buried in your home state, which state would you want to be buried in? That's interesting.
I have the mind recently that I might want to be cremated. I'll just throw that out there. I'm from Ohio. I'm living in Arizona now, Les. So I could imagine, maybe we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
I have a very soft spot for the ocean, and so maybe just being sprinkled into the Pacific from Hawaii or California,
there you go.
Take me out there and just dump me. It's fine.
Very cool. So what I want to end with is I want a really fun, funny, interesting, wacky story from you of one of these visits. It could be anything. It could be something that was really funny that happened to you. I mean, I shared my story of the Berkeley plantation. People who are familiar with my channel have also heard me when I actually went to Montpelier and visited Madison's grave. It was in the height of COVID. I was the only one on the grounds. Okay, this is the middle of the summer. The buildings were closed, but I was able to go see his gravesite. And as I was doing all these travels, I was using tons of hand sanitizer, of course, to try to stay safe. Well, I had this spray hand sanitizer, and I was spraying myself. So right before I got out of the car to go see his gravesite, I sprayed myself. And I didn't realize it, of course, at the time. I go see Madison's grave, and then I'm walking, if you kind of remember, you can walk from his gravesite to the slave cemetery, which is not too far away for where the enslaved people are buried there on the Madison plantation grounds. And all of a sudden, there's these bees. And I get like 2, 3, and then I get like a swarm of bees chasing me. And I'm running as fast as I can on the grounds of Montpelier because I realized afterwards that the hand sanitizer spray that I used was lavender scented.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, they thought I was a big flower. So, I mean, like that, something like fun or funny or even interesting or wacky that you experienced at any of these kind of places. And then there's one more question. But with all the great sites and cemeteries you've been to, have you ever noticed any? Okay. So go ahead. If you can answer that for me, Joe, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm struggling to think of, one of the funniest things was my first visit to the Ronald Reagan. I bought a package of jelly beans.
Okay.
And just Ronald Reagan iconic jelly beans. And my plan was I was going to drive up the Pacific coast. And so I was like, well, I knew where there was an In-N-Out burger. I'll wait. It's maybe an hour from there. And I got stuck in the worst traffic jam. And so I started like getting very hungry, and I thought I might pass out. And so in a fever, I like went and got the package of jelly beans, but they were all assorted kinds, and so like horrible flavors I hate, like popcorn and licorice.
Oh,
I was like throwing them back and like gagging, and so like all the way down the highway, I'm like trying to swallow some and spit out the others. That one stands out to me as just like a not planning ahead kind of story.
That's pretty funny.
I should have shared that one of my first jobs after my bachelor's degree was at the Hayes Center in Fremont.
Oh, okay.
And I was a kind of jack of all trades intern. And I had, as part of my internship experience, I lived across the street for a few months. And there I did encounter like a little bit of a ghost story. There was a little
Well, we just got to ask that, actually.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's a story that sticks out to
Go ahead,
me.
please. Please tell us.
So it was a house that was attached to it. We would hold teas there. So like they would have like little kids come over and like ladies who lunch kind of teas. And one of my experiences was I was, serving the teas. And the woman who ran the Dillon House, as it was called, she was asking me all these questions like, has anything happened to you? And finally I said, well, this one of my first nights there, I was like laying in bed. It was this very old house, like supposedly at the same time as the Spiegel Grove house that the Hayeses lived in across the street. And I heard the door open. I had the door locked and the door swings open and there's this little boy in a like wedding gown, what looked like a wedding gown to me. And so I laid back down and like said the Lord's Prayer. And when I sat back up, he was gone and the door was locked again. And I just thought, like, maybe I'm, something's wrong.
Maybe you're hallucinating.
I'm imagining things. I need to sleep or whatever. So I didn't say anything to anybody. And then the next night, I would always close all of they had like indoor shutters. I didn't want the light on my face. And in the middle of the night, all of the shutters like blew open. And I was again like, okay, this is, I have to be imagining this. So then when this lady asked, like, has anything happened? I was like, well, and I described these two things happening. She's like, oh, you met Charlie. And as soon as she said it, like all the hair stood up on the back of my head. She told me a few stories about at the Spiegel Grove that people would see the president at different times, like on the staircase and things like that. But this was my only experience. And it was a little boy that they believed had drowned in the in this house. And she's like, he's not going to hurt you. Just tell him you can't play. And so I did, and he never came back. So I was always like not wanting it to happen, but then also like, I wish I had a better story to tell you about it, but
that's pretty cool though. I'll tell you something. He may not be there to hurt me, but I got to tell you, if I saw Charlie in a wedding gown in the middle of the night, I would have been like one of those old, like, Looney Tune cartoons where you would have just saw a puff of smoke and I was gone. I would have been 10 miles down the road. So,
and so going to some of these houses when you are there past the time, I've gone, you're like the last tour, and there's always a part of me that's like, what would happen if you got like locked in at Berkeley or Mount Vernon or Monticello? Like the stories that have to go on, the weird sounds and that kind of thing. It would just be,
it would be interesting. Yeah. It's, people always ask me that, did I experience any supernatural things? Nothing supernatural. There was a couple eerie experiences I had. They're actually non-presidential, so I won't get into them, but at cemeteries, actually visiting grave sites of some murder victims, believe it or not. So, just some weird things. But I always felt a sense of, I don't know if it's eeriness, but just sadness, overwhelming sadness every time I've ever visited Kennedy's grave in Arlington. I think there's just this, if there's any presidential grave, I mean, they're all sad, especially, the ones that are assassinated, Garfield, Lincoln, McKinley. But there's just something really somber always about Kennedy's gravesite. So, that's kind of the only thing I can think of. Last question here before we wrap up. Which president shared their grave with the most people, or were they all buried alone? I will tell you this, that their actual plot themselves, their actual tomb themselves, I'm not quite sure of, but the person that has the most surrounding them has to be Jefferson, I would think.
The one that was coming to my mind was William Henry Harrison's. You've probably been in that in North Bend where they have a spot for his son and daughter-in-law, and I'm thinking there's others above and around, and like Jefferson's for sure.
With Jefferson, that's a huge,
like how close you're talking, because like Madison's buried around a lot.
Yeah.
There's a few that, just depending on how you would define, that.
Well, even Washington, there's several, family members right there. So I forgot what family member it is, but Supreme Court Justice that was in the Washington family is buried right there. So, I mean, very interesting. There you go. The Washington tomb contains 25 other than George and Martha. You know what? I should always just, anytime there's a question like that, I should just phone a friend. Bushrod, that's it. Thank you.
I think he should be our answer guy.
the Supreme Court Justice. I always, when it comes to grave sites, I text Kurt quite often. We're in communication a lot, and I hit him up What about this? Where's this person buried? Like,
when I did my trip this summer, I would just text him a photo of a gravesite from a distance and see if he could guess. And
oh
I
yeah,
spoke to him a couple times. I was at Augustine Washington's, there at Washington's birthplace.
yeah,
and,
birthplace, yeah.
You know, if you didn't know, I was like, he's related to, but not a president. And
yeah.
There was a few you can get Kurt on, but not too many.
Not
He's
no,
good.
I always tell him he's the original OG grave hunter. Like he's
got it down to
science. He's the legend. So, but Joe, you know, thank you so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun talking to you about all this stuff. I could talk to you forever about this stuff. So, but like I said, guys, go wherever you get podcasts from or wherever podcasts are available. Check it out. Visiting the Presidents is the name of the podcast with Dr. Joe Faykosh. Wonderful. He just wrapped up his first season, like I said, which is all about like the early lives and birthplaces of the presidents and such. Fascinating stuff. Go listen to all of that. And then, of course, season 2. Why don't you tell us when's the next season going to kick off? And real quick, what is that going to be about, season 2, Joe?
I'm shooting for President's Day to drop the first episode of season 2.
Awesome.
And with it will be the homes of the presidents. With season 1, I talked about their relationships with their parents. And the season 2, it'll be their wives and children, what they're like as parents. And then the years leading up to the president. So I ended the first one like about 10 years out from being president. This will continue into their presidency. And I'll probably do like highlights and lowlights. And then, of course, the focus will be on their home or the home that's most associated with them.
Very
There's,
nice.
Of course, lots of other places, but
yeah. And I'm sure that there will be some of them where you're probably even discussing a couple different homes, right?
That for sure. Yeah, there's a few that you can, you know, with Jefferson, for instance, you can go to a few different places.
Of course. Very cool. So like I said, go check it out. Visiting the Presidents. Season 2 is going to be starting right around President's Day, it sounds like, which is going to be awesome. Season 1's available on the podcast, so go check it out. It's awesome. You guys are going to love it. Joe, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate you doing this. I'm sure you and I will do something down the road again. You know, maybe after you wrap up each one of your seasons, you can come back on and talk to us about homes and that sort of thing after season 2. So thanks, guys. Thank you for all the participation, everybody watching. Joe, thanks again. And yeah, definitely this will be available on my YouTube channel, so anybody that wants to watch afterwards. So thanks, guys. Take care now.
Thank you so much. Take care.